I'll never forget the look on my stepmother's face when the lawyer revealed the secret codicil to my father's will. While she and my stepbrother sat there thinking they'd successfully stolen my inheritance, I watched their smug smiles vanish as they learned they'd get nothing. Absolutely nothing. While I got everything my father had truly intended for me. It all started 3 years ago on a crisp autumn afternoon. I was visiting my childhood home, the sprawling Victorian my father had lovingly restored over decades. The maple trees in the front yard were turning brilliant shades of orange and red, just like they had every fall of my life. I knocked on the door, balancing a homemade apple pie in one hand, Dad's favorite. His health had been declining recently, and these visits had become increasingly important to both of us. But instead of my father's warm welcome, I was greeted by my stepmother, Diane. "Oh, it's you," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "We weren't expecting you today." I knew immediately something was off. Dad and I had the same standing appointment every Sunday afternoon for years. Ever since Mom died when I was 16, these weekly visits had been our sacred ritual. "Is Dad okay?" I asked, trying to peer past her into the hallway. "He's resting," she said, blocking the doorway slightly. "Tyler is with him now." Tyler, my stepbrother, Diane's son from her previous marriage. Dad had married Diane when I was in college, and while I tried to be welcoming, there had always been a certain tension. Tyler was only 2 years younger than me, but he'd always treated my father like a personal ATM rather than a parent. "I won't disturb them," I promised. "I'll just leave this pie in the kitchen." Diane reluctantly stepped aside. As I walked through the familiar hallway, I noticed subtle changes. Photos of me and Dad had been moved to less prominent places. A large portrait of Tyler's college graduation now dominated the main wall. I heard voices coming from Dad's study, a room that had once been off-limits to everyone but me and him. It was where he kept his important papers, family heirlooms, and the collection of vintage watches he'd inherited from his father. "So this whole wall could come down?" I heard Tyler saying as I approached. "That would make the master suite twice as big." "Absolutely," replied a voice I didn't recognize. "Once the renovation starts, we could transform this whole wing." I pushed the door open without knocking. My father was sitting in his leather chair, looking frail and tired. Tyler stood with his back to me, gesturing grandly at the wall of bookshelves that held Dad's beloved first edition classics. Beside him stood a man in a suit, holding what looked like floor plans. "Emma!" Dad's face lit up when he saw me, though I noticed his smile seemed weaker than usual. Tyler spun around, quickly folding the papers in the stranger's hands. "Just discussing some home improvements," he said smoothly. "Nothing for you to worry about." "Home improvements?" I repeated, looking at my father. "Dad, are you feeling okay?" "Just a little tired today, sweetheart," he said. The doctor adjusted my medication. The stranger awkwardly introduced himself as an architect before making a hasty exit. Tyler followed him out, but not before giving me a look that clearly said I was interrupting. I sat with Dad, cutting him a slice of the pie I'd brought. His hands trembled slightly as he took the plate. "Dad, what was that about? Who's renovating the house?" He looked uncomfortable. "Diane thinks the place could use some updating. Nothing's been decided yet." "But this is your study, your space." "Well," he hesitated. "We all have to make compromises in a family." Something in his tone alarmed me. This wasn't the father I knew, the man who had stood his ground through a difficult divorce from my mother, who had built his accounting firm from nothing, who had taught me that integrity meant standing up for yourself. After that day, I started noticing more concerning patterns. My Sunday visits were increasingly met with excuses. Dad was sleeping, he had a doctor's appointment, he wasn't feeling up to company. When I did see him, Diane or Tyler was always present, hovering, monitoring our conversations. One evening, about 2 months later, I received a call from Dad's oldest friend and lawyer, Howard. "Emma, can you meet me for coffee tomorrow? There's something we need to discuss." We met at a quiet cafe downtown. Howard had been my father's friend since college and had handled all our family's legal matters for decades. He looked troubled as he stirred his coffee. "Your father came to see me last week," he said. "He wanted to make changes to his will." My stomach tightened. "What kind of changes?" "Significant ones," Howard sighed. "Emma, I've known your father for 40 years. The changes he's making, they don't sound like him. He wants to leave the house, the business, practically everything to Tyler." I felt like I'd been punched. "That can't be right. Dad always said the business would be mine someday. I've been working there since high school." "That's why I wanted to talk to you," Howard said. Diane came with him. She did most of the talking. "Your father seemed absent. When I tried to speak to him alone, she insisted on staying." "Is there anything we can do?" Howard leaned forward. "Legally, my hands are tied. But Emma, your father executed a previous will 5 years ago, after he married Diane. He also created something called a codicil, a legal amendment that he asked me to keep confidential until after his death." "What does it say?" "I can't tell you that," Howard said. "But I can tell you that your father was very clear about his wishes at that time, and they don't match what he's asking for now." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Tyler measuring my father's study, about the family photos being moved, about how difficult it had become to see my own father alone. The next day, I took a personal day from work and drove to my father's house, timing my visit when I knew Diane would be at her weekly hair appointment. To my surprise, Dad was alone. No Tyler, no home health aide that Diane had recently insisted they needed. "Emma!" Dad's face brightened when he opened the door. What a wonderful surprise. I hugged him tightly, noticing how much thinner he felt. "Dad, can we talk privately?" He led me to the kitchen, not his study, I noticed, and I made us both tea, just like Mom used to do when we had serious conversations. "Dad, I'm worried about you," I said directly. "I hardly see you anymore, and Howard told me you're changing your will." His eyes darted toward the doorway. "Diane thinks it's for the best. Tyler has big plans for the business." "Tyler knows nothing about accounting," I said. "He majored in art history and has never worked a day at the firm." "He has fresh ideas," Dad said, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. "Dad, this isn't you talking. What's really going on?" He stared into his teacup for a long moment. Then, in a voice so quiet I had to lean forward to hear, he said, "I'm just trying to keep the peace, Emma. Diane gets difficult when she doesn't get her way." "Difficult how?" He shook his head. "It doesn't matter. I'm tired, Emma. Too tired to fight anymore." In that moment, I saw something I'd never seen in my father before. Defeat. This man who had taught me to stand tall, to fight for what was right, was surrendering. "What about the business? The house? Everything you built?" "Sometimes we have to let go of things to keep what matters," he said cryptically. Before I could press further, we heard the front door open. Dad's expression changed instantly, a mask of calm sliding over the vulnerability he'd just shown me. Diane appeared in the kitchen doorway, her freshly styled hair perfectly framing her face. "Emma, what a surprise," she said, her voice honey-sweet but her eyes cold. "You should have called first." "Just having tea with my dad?" I said, matching her fake smile with one of my own. "Well, your father needs his rest." The doctor was very clear about limiting excitement. As she ushered me toward the door, I glanced back at my father. He gave me a small, sad smile and a nearly imperceptible nod. That nod told me everything I needed to know. My father was sending me a message. Over the next few weeks, I developed a strategy. Instead of fighting Diane head-on for access to my father, I became accommodating. I called before visits. I brought gifts for her and Tyler. I asked about her garden club and his art projects. I became the perfect stepdaughter. Slowly, their guard lowered. I was allowed longer visits with Dad. Sometimes I was even permitted to take him for short drives. "Just around the block and have him back for his medication," Diane would instruct. During these precious moments alone, I learned the full extent of what was happening. Dad's medication made him foggy and compliant. Diane controlled his doctor's appointments, his phone, his mail. Tyler had already started making decisions at the accounting firm, alienating long-term clients with his arrogance and inexperience. "They're so sure they've won," Dad told me during one of our drives, his voice clearer than it had been in months. "Tyler's already picked out the car he's going to buy with the proceeds from selling the business." "Can't you stop them?" I asked. He patted my hand. "Some battles aren't worth fighting, Emma, but some are worth preparing for quietly." That's when he told me about the recording devices he'd hidden in his study months ago, when he first suspected Diane was going through his papers. He'd captured conversations between her and Tyler, planning how they would spend his money after he was gone, discussing which of his possessions they'd sell, laughing about how easy it had been to manipulate him. "The recordings are in a locked drawer in my desk," he said. "The small key is taped under the third shelf in my closet." "Dad, we can use these to stop them now," I insisted. "No," he said firmly. "I don't have the strength for that fight, but I've made arrangements. Howard knows what to do." 2 months later, my father passed away in his sleep. The funeral was a somber affair, with Diane playing the grieving widow to perfection. Tyler stood beside her, appropriately sad-faced, though I caught him checking his watch during the eulogy. After the service, Diane approached me, her eyes red from theatrical tears. "Emma, dear, we need to discuss the house," she said. "Tyler and I thought you might want to come by next week to collect any personal items you'd like to keep." "Of course," I said mildly. "When would be convenient for you?" She seemed taken aback by my calm acceptance. "Wednesday, perhaps? The reading of the will is Thursday, so it would be good to have everything settled beforehand." "Wednesday is perfect," I agreed. That Wednesday, I arrived at my childhood home with several empty boxes. Diane greeted me with barely concealed impatience. "Tyler and I have already sorted through most things," she informed me. "We've set aside some photos and books we thought you might want." "How thoughtful," I said. "Would it be all right if I looked through Dad's study as well? There might be some mementos there." She hesitated. "Tyler has already packed up that room. He's converting it into a home office. I won't disturb anything, I promised. I just want to say goodbye to the space." Reluctantly, she led me to the study. The transformation had already begun. Dad's bookshelves were half empty, his desk cleared of personal items. Tyler had hung modern art prints where Dad's family photos had once been. "I'll leave you to it," Diane said. "Just don't take anything without checking with me first." As soon as she left, I moved quickly. I went to Dad's closet, still untouched, thankfully, and found the key exactly where he'd said it would be. With shaking hands, I unlocked the desk drawer and found a small digital recorder and a USB drive. I slipped both into my pocket just as Tyler walked in. Finding anything interesting? He asked, leaning against the door frame. Just memories, I said, closing the drawer. This room always meant so much to Dad. Well, it's going to mean a lot to me, too, Tyler said with a smirk. I've got big plans for this space. The architect thinks we can expand it into a proper master suite. You seem very confident about your plans, I observed. Why wouldn't I be? He shrugged. Dad and I were close. He knew I'd take good care of his legacy. I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing. Tyler had spent most of his visits asking Dad for money or complaining about his failed art career. I'm sure the will reading tomorrow will clear everything up, I said neutrally. Tyler's smile widened. I'm sure it will. Don't worry, Emma. We won't forget you entirely. Maybe we can give you a small memento or something. I left the house with my boxes of photos and books, plus the hidden evidence in my pocket. That night, I listened to the recordings and reviewed the files on the USB drive. What I heard made my blood boil. Diane instructing Tyler on how to manipulate my father, discussions about which medication made Dad most compliant, plans for selling the business I'd helped build, laughter about how they'd finally gotten rid of that interfering daughter. There were also photos of documents, copies of bank statements showing large transfers from my father's accounts to Diane's personal account, emails between Tyler and a real estate agent discussing selling the house before Dad was even gone. The next day, I arrived at Howard's office for the reading of the will, feeling strangely calm. Diane and Tyler were already there, seated in plush leather chairs across from Howard's desk. Diane wore a conservative black dress, still playing the grieving widow. Tyler couldn't quite hide his excitement, his knee bouncing with anticipation. Now that everyone's here, Howard began, we can proceed with the reading of Gerald Thompson's last will and testament. He pulled out a document and began reading the formal legal language. As he got to the distribution of assets, Diane reached over and squeezed Tyler's hand. To my wife, Diane Thompson, and her son, Tyler Winters, I leave my primary residence at 1842 Maple Street. All its contents, my investment portfolio, and full ownership of Thompson Accounting Services. Diane's smile was triumphant. Tyler didn't even try to hide his glee. To my daughter, Emma Thompson, Howard continued, I leave the sum of $10,000. Tyler actually snickered. I kept my face carefully blank. However, Howard said, looking up from the document, there is a codicil to this will executed by Gerald 5 years ago and updated 6 months ago with specific instructions that it be read immediately following the will. Diane's smile faltered. A codicil? Gerald never mentioned any codicil. It was executed privately, Howard explained, pulling out another document, and legally supersedes any contradictory provisions in the will. He began to read. I, Gerald Thompson, being of sound mind, hereby declare that if any changes are made to my will after the date of this codicil, such changes shall be considered valid only if accompanied by a handwritten letter to my daughter Emma, explaining my reasons for such changes. Diane shifted uncomfortably in her seat. As no such letter exists, Howard continued, the provisions of my original will, dated 5 years ago, shall stand as my final wishes. Tyler's face had gone pale. What does that mean? It means, Howard said, pulling out yet another document, that this is your father's true will. He began reading again. To my daughter, Emma Thompson, I leave my primary residence, 70% ownership of Thompson Accounting Services, and my investment portfolio. To my wife, Diane Thompson, I leave a life interest in our vacation property in Florida and a monthly stipend as outlined in our prenuptial agreement. Diane stood up, her face contorted with rage. This is ridiculous! Gerald changed his will! We have witnesses! The witnesses to the changed will were Tyler and Diane's brother, Howard noted. Gerald's codicil specifically addresses this possibility, noting that any changes witnessed by family members of Diane would be subject to additional scrutiny. This is fraud! Tyler shouted, jumping to his feet. We'll contest this! I wouldn't recommend that, I said quietly, speaking for the first time. I pulled out the USB drive from my pocket. Dad kept records, recordings of conversations between you two, bank statements, emails, evidence of how you manipulated his medication, isolated him from me, pressured him to change his will. The color drained from Diane's face. You're bluffing? I turned to Howard. Would you mind if we listened to a short clip? Howard connected the USB to his computer and played a recording. Diane's voice filled the room. Once the old man is gone, we'll sell the business immediately. His precious daughter won't get a cent. Followed by Tyler's laughter. I can't believe how easy this was. A few pills and his evening tea, and he'll sign whatever we put in front of him. I stopped the recording. The silence in the room was deafening. There's more, I said. Much more, including evidence of financial elder abuse, which is both a civil and criminal matter in the state. Diane collapsed back into her chair. Tyler's face had turned from pale to green. You have until the end of the week to remove your personal belongings from my house, I said, standing up. The locks will be changed on Monday. As for the business, your access to all accounts and systems will be revoked by the end of today. You can't do this, Diane whispered, but there was no conviction in her voice. Actually, I can, I replied. And if you contest the will or cause any further problems, these recordings go to the district attorney. Dad was willing to let things go for the sake of peace. I'm not nearly so forgiving. I walked out of Howard's office with my head held high. Behind me, I could hear Diane beginning to sob and Tyler starting to blame her for the failure of their scheme. The following Monday, I stood in my father's study, my study now, looking at the half-empty bookshelves and bare walls. One by one, I returned his books to their places, hung his photos back on the walls, restored the room to what it had been. On his desk, I placed the old teacup we'd used during our last real conversation. It was chipped on one side, imperfect, like our relationship had sometimes been, but still strong, still whole in all the ways that mattered. As I settled into his leather chair, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. Diane and Tyler had taken their clothes and personal items and disappeared, reportedly to Florida, where Diane still had rights to the vacation property. The accounting firm's clients had been relieved to hear I was taking over. Many had been on the verge of leaving after Tyler's brief tenure at the helm. Most importantly, I had preserved my father's true legacy. Not just his material possessions, but his values, his integrity, his commitment to doing what was right even when it was difficult. I opened the top drawer of the desk and found one last surprise, a sealed envelope with my name written in my father's shaky handwriting. Inside was a brief note. Emma, if you're reading this, then everything worked out as planned. I'm sorry for the pain and worry I caused you in my final months. Sometimes the best strategy isn't confrontation, but patience. Letting your opponents believe they've won until the moment they discover they've lost everything. I couldn't fight them at the end. I didn't have the strength, but I knew you would fight for me, for what was right. You always have. The house, the business, they're just things. What matters is that you know the truth, that I never stopped believing in you, never stopped loving you, never stopped being proud of the woman you've become. All my love, Dad. I traced my fingers over his familiar handwriting, tears blurring my vision. Then I carefully folded the letter and placed it in my pocket, next to my heart. Outside, the maple trees were turning again, their leaves brilliant orange against the clear blue sky. Another autumn, another cycle of endings and beginnings. I picked up my father's favorite teacup, chipped but still perfect in its way, and went to make a fresh pot of tea in my home, the home my father had always intended for me to have.